Welcome to Great Night Stories. Tonight, as part of our Fall Asleep to the Unknown series, we gently revisit the mysterious events of the Roswell Incident, a story of strange lights, unexplained wreckage, and secrets whispered beneath the vast New Mexico sky. Let yourself relax and sink into the calm of the desert night as we explore the quiet moments behind the headlines and the lasting legacy of a mystery that still lingers in the stars. Close your eyes. Breathe deeply and let the story carry you softly into peaceful sleep. Chapter 1: The Stillness Before the Storm. Long before the world turned its eyes to the quiet heart of New Mexico, the desert was a place of silence, solitude, and time slowed to the rhythm of the wind. In the summer of 1947, the land that would become known across the globe as Roswell was nothing more than a quiet expanse of open sky, scrub brush, and dirt roads that stretched endlessly into the horizon. The sun rose each day with a kind of deliberate patience, spilling amber light over the dry plains and the crooked fences that lined the pastures. Sagebrush swayed gently, and the morning air smelled of dust and dew. Life was slow here, purposeful. The town of Roswell itself was modest, a dot in the landscape where life moved to the rhythm of work, weather, and whispers shared over diner counters and feed store shelves. Some 75 miles northwest of town lay the Foster Ranch, tucked into the rolling hills like a forgotten corner of the earth. It was here that Emser Brazel lived and worked, a weathered man of few words and steady hands. Mac had spent years tending this land, riding fences, checking windmills, and watching the skies with the same casual awareness that came from a lifetime under them. The sky to him was a familiar companion until it wasn't. On the night of July 2nd, a dry stillness hung over the desert like a held breath. The cicadas had gone quiet, and the usual summer storm clouds hovered far in the distance, flickering with lightning but offering no rain. Sometime past midnight, Mac was roused by a sound, strange and sharp. It wasn't thunder, not exactly. It had a metallic quality to it, as though something enormous had torn through the air and fractured the silence. And then nothing. Just the night again, just the stars. He didn't think much of it in the moment. The desert had its moods after all. Sometimes it groaned, sometimes it sang. Mac rolled over, pulled the blanket back over his shoulder, and fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, with the sun already blazing down from a cloudless sky, Mac mounted his horse and rode out as he always did, scanning the pasture for cattle. The heat was rising off the earth in shimmering waves. Birds circled high overhead. The wind was dry and hot, carrying the faint scent of something that didn't belong, a burnt metallic trace that caught in the back of his throat. It wasn't long before he saw it. Stretching across a patch of field nearly a 4 mile wide was a swath of strange debris, not like anything he'd ever encountered. Small pieces of metal scattered like confetti, glinting silver and bronze under the sun. Some of the material looked like foil, but when he tried to crumple it, it unfolded itself again, smooth and unmarked. Other fragments were stiff and lightweight, etched with symbols that resembled hieroglyphs, precise alien shapes that meant nothing to him. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching against the brittle grass. He crouched, picked up a length of the material, and turned it over in his hands. It was cold to the touch, unnaturally so. It flexed, but would not tear. It held no screws, no rivets, no signs of human construction. Max stood there for a long while, hat tipped back, eyes squinting into the light. He took in the entire field, the scattered metal, the gouged earth, the silence that seemed deeper than it should be. No birds chirped, no cattle grazed nearby. The world for a moment felt hollowed out. He gathered a few pieces of the wreckage and secured them in his saddlebag. Then, without speaking a word, he turned back toward the ranch house. His thoughts were tangled, but a strange certainty had begun to form beneath them. Something had come down here, something that didn't belong to any plane or balloon or weather experiment. That evening, he sat alone on the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold, watching the horizon. The sun dipped low, casting the sky in golden fire before surrendering to dusk. Out there in the darkening fields, the debris still lay scattered beneath the stars, gleaming faintly like fallen pieces of the sky itself. He thought of the sound he'd heard the night before, that awful tearing that hollow quiet. He thought of the strange symbols, the unnatural metal, the deep quiet of the land. The air felt different now, charged, unsettled, as if the desert itself had taken a breath and not yet let it go. Later that night, Max stepped out once more into the cool air. The stars above him were brilliant, endless, cold, and silent. The wind carried with it a low whistle through the canyons, and somewhere far off, a coyote howled, lonely, thin, and distant. Something had happened out there, and though he didn't have the words for it yet, didn't know how far the ripples would travel, Mac Brazil understood in his bones that whatever had come down from the sky wasn't meant for this world. He stared into the night, still holding a sliver of that impossible metal in his hand, and whispered to the dark, "What the hell are you?" Chapter 2: A Crash in the Night. The night sky stretched endlessly over the New Mexico desert, a vast canvas of stars twinkling softly against the deep velvet of space. The moon cast a pale glow over the barren land, washing the jagged rocks and sagebrush in silver light. Everything was still, quiet enough to hear your own breath, the distant call of a coyote, or the whisper of wind through the grass. It was just past midnight on July 2nd, 1947. Few in the nearby town of Roswell stirred at this hour. Most were wrapped in sleep, their minds drifting through dreams beneath their humble roofs. But above them, something moved. High in the sky, far beyond the reach of street lamps and radios, a fiery streak blazed across the heavens. A sudden blazing arc of light that tore through the calm night like a falling star. It was bright, fierce, and unlike any shooting star anyone had ever seen. Down below on the Foster Ranch, M. Brussel's ears twitched as he lay awake in bed. The sharp crack of sound had jolted him from sleep earlier. A strange echoing boom that seemed to rattle the earth itself. Now, as he stared through the thin curtains, the night sky held its breath once more. Outside, the desert air was cool and dry. The scent of sage and distant pine lingered faintly in the breeze. But beneath that familiar aroma, there was something new, something alien. Mac rose slowly from his bed, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The ground was cool beneath his feet. The stars above seemed impossibly bright in the unpolluted sky. He scanned the horizon, eyes sharp in the moonlight. Then he saw it, a faint glow low on the far edge of the pasture, a distant flicker of fire against the dark earth. His heart quickened. He mounted his horse, urging it forward with steady hands. The familiar creak of the saddle was a comfort in the strange silence. As they neared the source of the light, the glow grew stronger, an eerie, pulsing orange that danced behind the desert scrub. When Mac arrived, the scene before him was unlike anything he could have imagined. The earth was torn open, a crater scorched black and smoking softly in the night air. Scattered across the clearing were shards of gleaming metal, twisted and warped, some glowing faintly from the heat. The pieces shimmered under the moonlight, their surfaces smooth and strange, unlike anything he'd ever seen. Among the wreckage, faint wisps of smoke curled upward, mingling with the desert breeze. The silence was deep, broken only by the occasional crackle of burning wood and the soft clatter of loose debris shifting in the wind. Mac dismounted, heart pounding as he walked among the fragments. The metal was light, almost weightless, but unbreakable. Some pieces bore strange symbols, delicate, intricate patterns etched into their surfaces. Others seemed almost transparent, shimmering with a faint internal glow. He reached down to touch a piece. It was cold, smooth, and hummed softly under his fingertips. A vibration most too subtle to feel. His mind raced. What had fallen here? A plane? No. The wreckage held no sign of engines, no familiar bolts or wiring. It was something else, something from another world. As the wind whispered through the desert grass, Mac felt a shiver run down his spine. He gathered a handful of debris and carefully tucked it into his saddlebag. Back at the ranch, the news spread quietly but quickly. By morning, whispers had begun in Roswell. Rumors of a flying disc that had crashed in the desert. The military was alerted. A weather balloon, they said, nothing more. But for those who saw the wreckage, who held the strange fragments in their hands, the truth was impossible to deny. Something had fallen from the sky that night, something not made by human hands. The desert would never be the same again. Chapter 3. Whispers Through the Wind. Morning arrived quietly over the sprawling New Mexico desert as the first soft rays of sunlight kissed the dusty earth and painted the endless sky in hues of pale gold and rose. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of dry sagebrush and distant pine. A gentle breeze began to stir, weaving through the tall grasses and carrying with it the murmurs of the desert, waking up from its long, peaceful slumber. But beneath this calm, a new current of energy rippled through the small town of Roswell and its surrounding ranches. The news, like a whisper carried on the wind, was spreading. Something extraordinary had fallen from the sky. Something the desert had kept secret through the night, but could no longer hide from the curious eyes of those nearby. At the Foster Ranch, Emser Brazel moved quietly around his home, the weight of the previous night's discovery pressing heavily on his mind. His thoughts were tangled, mixing disbelief with a rising sense of urgency. The strange metal fragments, the scorched earth, and that crackling otherworldly sound all replayed in his memory like fragments of a dream too vivid to ignore. Word reached Roswell quickly. By midday, neighbors were talking in hushed tones over fences and at the local diner. Some dismissed the tale as an exaggeration. Another cattle rancher's tall story brought to life by restless imaginations. Others, however, were gripped by a quiet excitement, their eyes alight with wonder and the allure of mystery. Among them was a small group of townsfolk who had ventured toward the ranch to catch a glimpse of the strange wreckage. They moved cautiously through the dusty fields, careful not to disturb the delicate evidence scattered across the land. Their voices were low, filled with a mixture of awe and unease. "It looks like nothing we've ever seen," one murmured, holding up a slender, silvery shard that reflected the sunlight in shimmering waves. "What kind of plane could this be?" "No plane," another replied softly. "No pilot could have survived something like this. Rumors began to take root like desert wildflowers after a rare rain. Tales spread of strange lights in the sky, of objects moving too fast and too strange to be explained away as mere weather balloons or military tests. Some claim to have seen glimmers of otherworldly craft in the night sky in the days before the crash, while others whispered of shadowy figures and unexplained sounds in the surrounding hills. Meanwhile, the military was already moving swiftly. Orders had been dispatched from higher command. Soldiers and officers from nearby Roswell Army Airfield arrived quietly, their faces set with a determined seriousness. They cordoned off the area, setting up tents and barriers to keep the curious at bay. Major Jesse Marcel was among the first to arrive at the crash site. A calm, composed officer with a keen eye for detail, Marcel carefully examined the scattered debris. He handled the pieces with gloved hands, noting their unusual properties. The lightweight metals that resisted bending, the strange symbols etched into their surfaces, the unyielding strength of materials unlike any standard aircraft components. Despite his professional demeanor, Marcel could not deny the growing mystery that surrounded the site. The more he examined, the more it became clear that this was no ordinary crash. As word spread, some locals whispered of flashes of light seen near the ranch in the hours before dawn. Others spoke of a distant humming sound, low and steady, like the thrumming of a great engine. Children told of strange shapes glimpsed against the moonlit sky, shapes that moved with an unnatural grace and speed. The people of Roswell, a town used to open skies and wide horizons, found themselves caught between skepticism and wonder. Many wanted answers. Many feared what those answers might be. Yet the official line was firm and brief. A weather balloon had crashed, nothing more. But as the days passed, it became clear that the truth was tangled in shadows and silence. Witnesses who had seen the debris or who claimed to have heard strange sounds were met with skepticism or worse. The military tightened its hold on information, and stories of cover-ups began to stir. The desert, patient and enduring, kept its secrets. But the wind carried whispers, soft, insistent whispers that stirred the imagination and beckoned the curious to listen closely. Underneath the vast, endless sky, a mystery had been born, and the world, whether ready or not, was beginning to awaken to it. Chapter 4. Major Marcel's Journey. The morning sun had not yet crested the horizon when Major Jesse Marcel stepped out of his modest quarters at Roswell Army Airfield. A faint blush of light stretched across the eastern sky, washing the desert in soft pastels. The air was still cool, a reprieve from the heat that would rise later in waves from the earth. The base, usually slow to stir at this hour, was already humming. He paused for a moment outside the barracks, breathing in the crisp air and listening. The distant sound of boots on gravel, the muted thrum of a generator, the clipped voices of two officers exchanging early orders. Everything had that quiet urgency particular to military life. But today, there was something else in the air. A subtle current beneath the surface. He felt it in his bones before the message even reached him. Marcel was a thoughtful man, soft-spoken, meticulous, and observant, a seasoned intelligence officer with years of service behind him. He had learned to pay attention to the things others missed, the way men hesitated, the way stories bent under pressure. He didn't jump to conclusions, but he trusted his instincts. And this morning, they told him something unusual had begun. The report came in around dawn. An object had been found on a remote ranch northwest of Roswell. Scattered debris, strange materials, symbols, nothing familiar. The rancher had brought some of it into town, and local law enforcement didn't know what to make of it. Whatever it was unlike anything they'd seen before. Marcel listened closely, nodding slowly. He didn't interrupt. When the briefing concluded, he folded the note and slipped it into his jacket. "I'll go myself," he said. The jeep was already prepared. As he drove out of the base and onto the open road, the hum of the engine blended with the vast silence of the landscape. The desert stretched around him, endless and quiet, broken only by scattered fences, dry riverbeds, and the occasional shadow of a hawk circling overhead. The morning light cast long shadows, and the wind moved gently through the mesquite and tumbleweed. He drove for miles, the tires crunching softly over the dirt track that led toward the Foster Ranch. His thoughts wandered. He considered every possibility. Experimental aircraft, a downed satellite, maybe even some kind of new Soviet surveillance device. But none of those ideas sat quite right with him. There was a weight to the descriptions, a quality to the language used by the sheriff and rancher that told him this wasn't routine. Something about it had shaken them. By the time he arrived at the ranch, the sun had fully risen. The light was clean and sharp, stretching across the dry ground like a golden curtain. Brazel stood by the fence near the gate, his hat tilted low over his brow, arms folded. He gave Marcel a small nod as the jeep rolled to a stop. "Morning," Mac said simply. Marcel stepped out and offered his hand. Major Jesse Marcel, intelligence officer out of Roswell. Mac Brazil, the rancher replied, his voice dry as the land around them. "I reckon you'll want to see it for yourself." He led Marcel on horseback to the crash site, a wide, windswept section of pasture where the earth had been disturbed, as though something had skidded or burst apart upon impact. The debris was everywhere. It glittered in the sun, spread across the field in long, uneven trails. Marcel crouched beside one of the larger pieces and reached out. It was unlike any material he'd handled before, thin and metallic, almost like foil, but impossibly strong. He folded it in his hands. It bent without creasing and sprang back into shape. No seams, no weld marks, no indication of how it had been constructed. Another shard bore symbols, delicate, symmetrical etchings that didn't resemble any language he knew. He brushed his fingers over them, feeling the grooves. Not paint, not scratches. They were built into the metal itself. "What do you make of it?" Mac asked after a long silence. Marcel straightened slowly, eyes still fixed on the fragment in his hand. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but it's not from anything I've seen in my time." They spent hours collecting samples, filling boxes, and wrapping each piece in canvas. Marcel made careful notes, though words felt insufficient. He didn't yet know how to describe what he was seeing. By late afternoon, the Jeep was loaded. Max stood beside it, watching with narrowed eyes as the strange materials were tied down. "You'll be taking it back to the base?" he asked. Marcel nodded. "It needs to be examined properly. I'll report what I find." He didn't promise answers. He couldn't. Max seemed to understand. With a simple shake of hands, the rancher turned back toward his home, vanishing slowly into the heat haze. The ride back was quiet. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the hills in deep ochres and rust. Marcel kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting on a box beside him. His mind churned with questions he had no answers for. What had fallen in that field? Where had it come from? And why did it feel like something important had begun? Instead of going straight to the base, he made a stop. His house was quiet. His wife was out, but his young son was home playing in the yard. Marcel called him over, showing him a piece of the material. "Take a look at this," he said, handing it over gently. The boy turned it in his hands, eyes wide. "It's like magic," he whispered. Marcel smiled faintly, watching him. "Yeah," he said, more to himself than anyone. "It kind of is." He collected the material again, carefully repacked it, and headed back toward the base. Night had begun to fall by the time he arrived. He turned the Jeep over to the guards, stepped out into the cooling air, and looked up at the darkening sky. Stars were beginning to appear, scattered like silver dust across the heavens. He stood there a while, staring upward. Whatever had come down hadn't come from here. Chapter 5. Objects Unknown. The sky had already surrendered to dusk by the time Major Jesse Marcel returned to Roswell Army Airfield. The last traces of daylight faded over the horizon, and a cool wind rolled over the base, carrying with it the faint scent of grease, sand, and sun-baked concrete. In the growing stillness, the desert seemed to hold its breath. The base was quieter now. The usual bustle of daytime had calmed, replaced by a muted rhythm, soft radio chatter, the distant creak of a supply truck, and the buzz of a flickering overhead lamp outside the main hangar. As Marcel pulled the Jeep to a stop near the intelligence office, A tired mechanic raised a hand in silent greeting. Marcel nodded back, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He stepped out of the vehicle and moved quickly to the rear. The boxes were still there, tied tightly under canvas, protected from dust and prying eyes. He stood for a moment, watching the breeze play along the edges of the tarp, then unfastened the ties. With deliberate care, he lifted the first box and carried it inside. The office was small, just a few desks, filing cabinets, and a map of the Southwest pinned across one wall. A single desk lamp lit the room, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Captain Sheridan Cavett was already waiting, sipping from a steaming mug of coffee, his uniform slightly rumpled. "You brought it?" Cavett asked. "I brought it," Marcel replied. He set the box down gently. Cavett rose from his chair, setting the mug aside. The two men opened the lid together, and the dull lamplight fell on the fragments inside. At first there was silence. Then Cavett reached down and pulled out a thin metallic strip. It bent easily between his fingers, but when he let go, it returned to its original shape as though untouched. He turned it over, inspecting the surface. Smooth, flawless, impossibly light. "What is this?" he murmured. Marcel didn't answer. Instead, he lifted a second piece, a curved section, dull silver with faint violet tones that shimmered in the light. The edges were clean and cold to the touch. On the inner curve, just barely visible, was a line of symbols, delicate, intricate characters, like a language not meant to be read, but remembered. Cavett moved to another box and lifted what looked like a beam or support. It was hollow, feather light, yet sturdy. The two men examined it in silence, the weight of their confusion growing heavier with each piece. "This isn't from any aircraft I've ever seen," Cavett finally said. "It's not from any aircraft anyone's seen," Marcel replied. They continued examining the wreckage. One piece was oddly textured, almost like snake skin, but smooth and cold. Another had a thin membrane stretched across a delicate frame like a wing, except it had no moving parts, no hinges or bolts. Everything seemed grown rather than built. They found no wires, no electronics, no motors or propellers. The materials defied everything they understood about engineering. For over an hour they worked, speaking in low voices, passing pieces between them like fragile relics from another time. The room grew warmer under the desk lamp, and still neither man could offer an explanation. Eventually, Cav leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. Maybe a high-altitude test vehicle, something experimental, top secret. Marcel looked at him. Then why were we never briefed? Why would it crash on a ranch in the middle of nowhere with no retrieval plan? Why the symbols? David didn't answer. A silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, but heavy with meaning. No one said it aloud. Not yet. But the thought lingered in the room like a scent. What if it wasn't from here at all? After a while, Marcel stood. He began repacking the fragments with careful hands, wrapping each piece in cloth and sliding it back into the box. Cavett helped, neither of them speaking now. The work was methodical, slow, and reverent. Once the last box was sealed, Marcel carried it to the secure storage room, locked it, and handed the key to the night watch officer. Then, without another word, he left the building and walked back to his quarters. The night air was cool and still. Crickets chirped softly in the weeds, and a single spotlight cast a pale beam across the empty lots between buildings. Marcel moved through the quiet like a ghost, his thoughts louder than his footsteps. Inside his quarters, he removed his jacket, set it over the back of a chair, and poured himself a glass of water. He didn't drink it. Instead, he sat on the edge of his bed, staring down at his boots, hands resting quietly in his lap. He could still feel the material between his fingers. He leaned back and closed his eyes. Images swam before him, twisting metal, pale symbols, the shimmer of moonlight on strange surfaces. He thought of the rancher's quiet voice, the children's eyes wide with wonder, the disbelief etched into Cavett's face. You lay back slowly, folding his hands behind his head. Above him, the ceiling was just plaster and paint. But beyond it, out there in the vast sky, stars wheeled overhead, silent and ancient. He imagined the crash again, the object falling, spiraling through the dark, the impact, the silence after. It hadn't come from any country he knew. It hadn't come from Earth. That thought returned to him again and again, gentle but insistent, like waves lapping against the shore. And as he drifted slowly toward sleep, it stayed with him. Something had arrived, and it had left behind more questions than answers. Chapter 6. A statement, then a silence. Morning came again to Roswell, New Mexico, warm and bright, as the desert sun spilled over the barracks and the mesole, lighting the gravel paths and the low buildings in a gentle amber hue. By the time most of the town was reaching for coffee and newspapers, something quietly unusual was unfolding at Roswell Army Airfield. Inside the small public information office, a corporal tapped at a typewriter, the clack of metal keys echoing softly off the walls. An officer leaned over his shoulder, brow furrowed, watching as a few brief lines were typed and centered on the page. It was a short statement, simple, measured. The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday. It read, when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force, Roswell Army Airfield, was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc through the cooperation of a local rancher and the sheriff's office of Chavez County. That was it. No embellishments, no explanations. Just enough to stir the imagination. By mid-morning, the release had been handed off to the local press and sent over wire services. Within hours, the words flying disc danced across headlines from Roswell to Chicago. In town, radios flickered on. In diners, shops, and barber chairs, voices rose with disbelief and speculation. Flying disc found in the desert. At the Roswell Daily Record, the editor read the typed statement twice, then once more for good measure. The headline wrote itself. By late afternoon, the front page bore 5 bold words that would echo through history. AF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. The phones began ringing. Some callers were excited. Others were skeptical. But none were indifferent. The quiet town, used to sun, sand, and the occasional burst of small-town gossip, had suddenly found itself at the center of something vast and strange. At the diner on Main Street, conversations buzzed between bites of toast and sips of coffee. I heard it was glowing, someone said, voiced low and full of awe. My cousin said his friend saw it streak across the sky 3 nights ago. Another replied, said it moved like lightning, then stopped cold. Maybe it's from Russia, someone whispered. Maybe, another said, or maybe it's not from Earth at all. People laughed nervously, but the unease was real, and the curiosity even more so. Back on base, however, the mood had already begun to shift. The celebration of discovery, if it ever existed, was brief. By early afternoon, Heil communications were coming in. Quiet, but firm, urgent. The order was clear. Retract the statement. Marcel wasn't surprised. Not entirely. The mystery had grown too quickly. The word disk already spinning far beyond their control. The brass wanted the narrative back in their hands. Another statement was drafted, this one even shorter, more clinical. It declared the object recovered was not a disk at all, but merely a weather balloon. Standard meteorological equipment misidentified by a well-meaning rancher and an overzealous officer. To support the change in story, a photograph was arranged. Marcel was called in. He stood dutiful and tired beside a broken balloon and a pile of foil-like material that bore no resemblance to what he had collected days earlier. The press snapped the image. It would be printed in papers around the country. Headline changed. The story shifted from excitement to explanation, from mystery to mistake. But for those who had seen the first pieces, Monsieur Brazel, Marcel himself, and a handful of others, the retraction rang hollow. Something about it felt too neat, too easy. Later that night, Marcel sat alone in his quarters. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a lamp on his desk. A radio played faintly in the background, some piano ballad floating in from a distant station, barely audible through the static. He removed his cap and rubbed his eyes. He had followed orders, played his part, but his thoughts kept returning to the wreckage, the impossible metal, the etched symbols, the way the light had bent off the surface, the way the material had folded and straightened like it remembered its shape. He thought of his son holding that piece in their kitchen, the wonder in his eyes. He thought of Cavitt's silence and the way neither of them could find the right words to describe what they had seen. And now there was silence again. Officially, the matter was closed. The wreckage had been flown out to Fort Worth for further examination, or perhaps simply to disappear. There would be no further statements, no open investigations, just the retraction, just the weather balloon. Outside, the desert air cooled. Crickets began their soft chorus. Somewhere on the edge of town, a dog barked once, then fell quiet again. In homes across Roswell, people turned off their radios and folded their newspapers. Lights clicked off. Curtains were drawn. But before they closed their eyes, many looked once more out their windows, up into the stars. Somewhere out there, far beyond the reach of radar or reason, something had come down. Something had passed overhead, and for a moment left a trace. And now, like dust over time, the official silence was already beginning to cover it. Chapter 7, Mac's Second Visit. The morning broke quietly over the Foster Ranch. A pale light rose behind the hills, turning the low clouds a soft shade of apricot as the wind moved gently through the grasses. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, and somewhere beyond the barn, a lone steer bellowed into the stillness. Mac Brazel stood outside his small home, hands in his pockets, eyes on the horizon. The desert didn't change often, but Mac noticed when it did. That morning, he felt something different in the air, some barely perceptible shift that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It wasn't just the lingering memory of the strange wreckage. It wasn't just the silence that followed. It was the tracks. He had found them at the edge of his property, wide tire marks pressed deep into the dirt and footprints scattered near the Ao-O-Yo where the wreckage had been. Not his boots, not his horse, not the sheriff's men. Someone else had been there, and recently. And they hadn't come to talk. He hadn't heard a vehicle in the night, but that didn't mean much. The desert was vast, and sound could carry strangely or not at all, depending on the wind. He found a few cigarette butts near the fence line. One still smelled of smoke. Mac fed the animals, checked the perimeter of his pasture, and returned to the barn. He moved slowly, keeping an eye on the hills around him. There was no one in sight, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. By mid-morning, he'd made up his mind. He saddled his horse again and made for town. Roswell shimmered in the summer heat as he rode in. The streets were busier than they had been earlier in the week. Reporters, townsfolk, men in suits who didn't quite look like locals. A few waved at him as he passed, but Mac didn't return the gesture. He rode with his head slightly down, hat pulled low over his brow. He tied the horse outside the sheriff's office and stepped inside, the door creaking faintly behind him. Sheriff George Wilcox looked up from his desk. "Well, morning again," Mac nodded, but his face was different than before. The first time he came in, there had been a strange fire in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or disbelief. This time there was something else. Hesitation, caution, maybe even fear. "You got a minute?" Mac asked, his voice quiet. "Sure," the sheriff replied. Motion. They moved into the small office behind the front desk. It smelled of leather and paper, the scent of old wood and dust hanging in the air. Mac closed the door behind them. He didn't sit. "I've been thinking," Mac began. "Maybe I shouldn't have said nothing." Will Wilcox tilted his head. "You mean about the wreckage?" Mac nodded. "I don't know what that stuff was. I still don't. But ever since I brought it in, I've had this feeling." "What kind of feeling?" "Like someone's watching me," Max said, eyes flicking toward the window. "I seen tracks on my land. Not mine, not yours, not the army's. At least not anyone I saw. Footprints, big ones. No horses, just boots." Wilcox leaned forward, elbows on his desk. "Anyone come up to the house?" "No, not yet. But I seen a shadow out near the well 2 nights ago, and yesterday my dog wouldn't go near the barn." The sheriff was quiet for a moment, watching him. "You think someone's trying to scare you off?" "I don't know," Mac admitted. "But I know I ain't telling the whole story again." Will Wilcox nodded slowly. "You don't have to. But if someone's snooping, you let me know. We'll keep watch." Mac didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted to the floor, then to the wall. then finally back to the door. Outside, a knock echoed in the main office. It was a reporter again. Word had gotten out that Mac was back in town, and the press was eager for another quote, another glimpse into the strange event that had swept through Roswell like a sandstorm. Mac left the office reluctantly and met the reporter near the door. The man was polite, well dressed, with a notepad already in hand. "Mr. Brazel," he said smoothly, "would you mind speaking again? Just a few clarifications." Mac looked at him a long moment. Then, with a hollow voice, he replied, "I made a mistake. Found a bit of weather balloon. Didn't know what it was. That's all." The reporter blinked, but the army said I was wrong. Mac cut in a bit too quickly. "That's all I've got to say." And with that, he turned and stepped out into the sun. Later that day, he left Roswell just as quietly as he'd come. Some locals saw him off, confused by the sudden change in tone. They whispered about it. Some wondered if he'd been warned. Others said he was just embarrassed. A few thought he'd been told to keep quiet. And my only "yuh" is none of them had answers. That evening, Max sat on his porch again, the same way he had days earlier. The sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the fields. His cattle were restless, shifting more than usual. The wind carried a scent he didn't recognize, something metallic, faint, and distant. Above him, the stars returned, silent and bright. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and stared up into the night. Whatever had happened out there, he couldn't explain it. And he had the growing sense that no one would ever let him try. Chapter 8: The Disappearance of Evidence. The days following the initial discovery passed quietly at Roswell Army Airfield. But beneath the surface, a different kind of motion was underway, one that moved in shadows and whispers rather than in loud commands or sweeping announcements. It was a movement that sought not to reveal, but to conceal. Major Jesse Marcel noticed it first as he continued to gather his thoughts and prepare his reports. Subtle changes began to ripple through the offices and hangars where the wreckage had been examined. Men who had once shared glances of excitement or disbelief now avoided each other's eyes. Conversations fell abruptly silent when strangers approached. One morning, Marcel arrived early to find his workspace empty of a report he had carefully written the night before. A detailed account of the wreckage, the symbols, the unexplainable strength of the materials. The file was nowhere to be found. When he asked around, the answer was vague. It must have been misplaced. But Marcel knew better. Nearby, a mechanic who had helped unload crates from the hangar was suddenly reassigned to a post hundreds of miles away. No explanation, no farewell. Just a quiet transfer that sent a clear message. The boxes containing the fragments of the strange object began to vanish as well. Where there had once been a carefully catalogued collection of metal shards and delicate materials, there was now only empty space behind locked doors. One crate, witnessed by several men to be stored in a secure corner, was gone by the next day, leaving only silence in its place. Photographs taken during the first investigation suffered a similar fate. Negatives and prints were confiscated, shredded, or simply disappeared from archives. Men who had handled the cameras refused to speak of the images they captured, their expressions guarded and distant. Locals who had once spoken freely about what they saw grew quiet too. Neighbors who had joked about strange lights and eerie sounds now glanced nervously over their shoulders, wary of who might be listening. A nurse at the base hospital who had overheard hushed discussions in the corridors was quietly transferred away, her absence noted but unspoken. In the midst of this growing hush, Major Marcel felt the weight of isolation press down upon him. Requests for updates on the investigation went unanswered. Follow-up inquiries were met with polite refusals or quick changes of subject. The story that had captured the town's imagination was slowly being rewritten, not in newspapers or official reports, but in the fading memories of those who lived it. As the tangible pieces disappeared, so too did the words that described them. Names were redacted from documents. Locations were altered or erased. Conversations were rephrased. Facts blurred until the truth seemed to slip through the fingers of time itself. It was as if the event was being erased, not with force or fanfare, but with a quiet, deliberate patience. Like dust carried on the desert wind, the evidence scattered and faded, leaving behind only a whisper, a trace barely felt but never fully gone. One evening, Marcel sat alone outside his quarters, watching the sun dip behind the distant mesas. The sky deepened from orange to indigo, and stars began to emerge, shimmering like distant lanterns in the vast dark. He thought not of what had been discovered, but of what had vanished. The pieces he had held in his hands, the symbols etched into metal that no one else could explain, the stories that were no longer told. The desert breeze stirred the dry grass at his feet, carrying with it the softest hint of memory, the faint, lingering breath of something lost, something hidden. Marcel closed his eyes and let the quiet settle around him. The world might never fully know what had come down in that lonely stretch of New Mexico desert, but for those who had been there, who had touched the impossible, the silence itself spoke volumes. And so the story remained, hidden, silent, waiting beneath the stars. Chapter 9. The Secret Meetings. In a quiet, windowless room, far from the bright desert sun and the dusty plains of New Mexico, a small group of men gathered under the weight of unspoken truths. The air was thick with a careful stillness, as if the walls themselves had learned to hold their breath. It was late, well past the hour, when most had left their posts for rest. But here, behind locked doors and guarded corridors, the night was alive with cautious deliberation. Around a heavy wooden table lay photographs, documents, and carefully wrapped samples, remnants of something no one fully understood, yet everyone felt the gravity of. The men, dressed in crisp uniforms and tailored suits, leaned forward, eyes scanning each detail with a mix of curiosity and concern. A senior officer cleared his throat and began the briefing. His voice was low but firm. "What we have recovered," he said, "is unlike anything in our known arsenals or research. The material, light, strong, resistant to heat, defies conventional explanation. The symbols etched onto some fragments do not match any known language or code." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "We have photographs, physical samples, and multiple eyewitness accounts. The implications are profound. One man shifted in his chair. Are we certain this is not a foreign experiment? Soviet technology, perhaps? Unlikely, the officer replied. No radar detected any aircraft in the area. The speed and maneuverability described by witnesses do not fit any earthly craft. The room grew quiet. Another voice, calm but resolute, broke the silence. If this is truly not from this world, and what do we owe to the public? Do we tell them? The question hung heavy in the air. Eyes met around the table, searching for answers no one wanted to say aloud. One official spoke carefully. Disclosure risks panic. Our society is not prepared for such a revelation. There are strategic concerns too. Technology, diplomacy, national security. A younger officer added, if word got out, it could trigger an arms race unlike any before. We could lose control of the narrative. But if we hide it, another voice countered, we risk losing trust. History has shown that secrecy breeds suspicion. The debate unfolded in muted tones, measured and deliberate. Arguments circled around the potential benefits and dangers. The men were not just officers and bureaucrats. They were custodians of a secret that could reshape the world, and each understood the burden they carried. After long consideration, consensus began to form. The findings would be kept under strict secrecy. Physical evidence would be secured and removed from public view. Witnesses would be instructed to maintain silence, and the press would be managed carefully to avoid speculation. The story would be refrained, if mentioned at all, as a misidentified weather balloon, a mistake that could be easily explained. A senior official concluded, our priority must be stability both at home and abroad. We must ensure that this knowledge does not cause fear or chaos. Orders were drafted quietly. A chain of command would enforce the new narrative. The delicate balance of secrecy and control was set in motion. One by one, the men rose and gathered their papers. As they left the room, their footsteps echoed softly against the cold floor. Outside, the world carried on, unaware of the silent pact made in the dark. Behind them, the door closed with a gentle click, sealing the secret away. And in the quiet that followed, the story of what had come down in the desert began its slow, careful fade into shadow. Chapter 10: The Legacy of Roswell. The years rolled on, and the desert around Roswell settled once more into its timeless rhythm. The sun rose and fell, painting the sky in endless shades of amber and gold, while the wind whispered through the sagebrush and mesquite, carrying with it memories both faint and vivid. The story of the strange object that had fallen from the sky began to drift gently into the realm of folklore. Early news reports faded from the front pages, replaced by other headlines and the steady flow of daily life. Yet beneath the surface of everyday chatter, the memory remained alive, passed quietly from one generation to the next, like a whispered secret. Families who had heard the tale told it in hushed tones. Neighbors remembered the unusual excitement of that summer. Witnesses carried their memories like precious, fragile things, too complex to fully explain, too strange to forget. As decades passed, Roswell became a symbol, a touchstone for the curious and the skeptical alike. Books appeared on shelves, documentaries flickered across television screens, and films reimagined the incident in vibrant colors and dramatic scenes. Each retelling added layers of interpretation and mystery, weaving fact and fiction into a tapestry that captivated millions. Some stories grew tall and wild, stretching beyond the truth to entertain and astonish. Others sought to dismiss and explain away the strange events, grounding them firmly in the known world. Yet, despite the debate and doubt, the question endured. What really happened in those quiet New Mexico fields so long ago? For those who had lived through it, the men like Jesse Marcel, the rancher M. Brazel, the officers who handled the wreckage, the legacy was deeply personal. They bore the weight of a secret that few could understand, a knowledge that shaped their lives quietly and profoundly. Marcel's son remembered his father's stories, told softly and carefully, never fully revealing the whole truth. Brazil carried his memories with a mixture of wonder and regret. knowing that some questions might never find answers. And Cavett, like many others, lived with the silent echo of something extraordinary hidden behind official words and carefully crafted narratives. And so the mystery lived on, not as a tale of fear or frenzy, but as a gentle invitation to wonder in the quiet moments before sleep, when the mind drifts softly between waking and dreaming. The story returns. It becomes a soft murmur in the darkness, a whisper carried on the desert breeze. It asks us to remember that there is still so much we do not know, that the universe is vast and full of possibility, that sometimes the greatest beauty lies not in answers, but in the questions themselves. As you close your eyes now, let the stillness settle around you like a soft blanket. Let the stars guide you gently into rest. And if you hear a faint sound on the wind, a shimmer of metal, a silent symbol traced in the night, know that the story is still there, waiting, peaceful and patient. Sleep well beneath the endless sky. If you're still awake, you're in for something a little different now. Here are some eerie, lesser known UFO encounters from around the world. Strange events, quiet sightings, and unsettling moments reported by ordinary people. Tales that never made the headlines, but left deep impressions on those who lived them. You're safe here. Just listen and drift as the mysteries unfold. Story 1: The Nameless Farm. It was a cold November evening in 1974, just outside the wooded hills of rural Pennsylvania. A small family farm tucked away on the edge of the Appalachian foothills was settling in for the night. The father, Harold, had just finished locking up the barn. His wife and 2 children were already inside, their dinner finished, the fire crackling low. Outside, the wind whispered through the bare branches. As Harold stepped back toward the house, he paused. The air felt still, too. No crickets, no wind. The quiet had weight to it. Then he heard it, a low, resonant hum like a distant engine, but deeper. It vibrated in his chest more than his ears. He scanned the sky, expecting to see a helicopter or perhaps a low-flying plane, but there was nothing, just a cloudless sky and the crescent moon hanging pale and thin. Then the lights came. First one, then two, then a ring of them, hovering above the old wooden barn. They glowed softly at first, white with a bluish tinge, and then began to pulse one by one around the edges of something he couldn't quite make out. The craft was perfectly silent. It hovered no more than 30 feet above the barn roof. Slowly, rhythmically, a beam of pale light stretched downward like a slow moving searchlight. Harold froze. He couldn't move. He couldn't call out. His breath hung in the air, but his limbs wouldn't respond. It was as if time had slowed, or he had been pinned to the earth by something unseen. Inside the house, his wife stood up from the living room window. She had seen the lights, too. She called out to Harold, but he didn't answer. She grabbed a flashlight and flung the door open, but the moment she stepped outside, the power went out. Lights, heat, all that gone in an instant. She stood on the porch, her flashlight flickering weakly, casting more shadow than light. The air smelled strange, like metal or ozone. The only illumination came from the glowing object above the barn. She watched in horror as the beam scanned across the ground, then lingered right where the cow pen stood, and then it was gone. No sound, no rush of wind, just darkness. Power returned a few minutes later, as if nothing had happened. But in the morning, the cows were missing. All of them. No broken fences, no blood, no signs of panic, just empty pens and strange blackened circles in the grass. The ground was dry, but one section near the barn was scorched. The metal water trough had been warped as if exposed to immense heat, yet the barn itself was untouched. The police filed the report, but there wasn't much they could do. No tracks, no suspects, just a shaken family with a story no one wanted to believe. The farm dog refused to go near the barn for weeks. The grass never grew back in the scorched area. Harold never quite recovered. He grew quiet, withdrawn. He sold the farm the following spring, moving his family into town, far from the place he once called home. When asked what happened that night, he would only shake his head and say, "Some things ain't meant for us to understand." Over time, the story faded. Locals called it a tall tale. Kids whispered about the ghost barn in the woods. But those who knew Harold knew he wasn't the kind of man to make things up, and his wife, quiet and practical, refused to talk about it at all. To this day, the new owners of the land say they've seen nothing strange. But if you walk past the old barn late at night, you might still hear the faint hum in the distance and wonder what came to visit the nameless farm on that cold November night. Story 2. The Red-Eyed Watcher. It was early March, still deep winter in the forests of northern Finland. Snow blanketed the ground in a thick, silent layer, and the sky hung low with heavy clouds. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs, but that didn't stop Carvey, a 38-year-old postal worker, from taking his usual walk through the pine woods near Roven. He liked the solitude, the hush of the snow, the soft crunch of his boots on the forest path. The old pines, with their dark, twisted limbs, stood tall and silent all around him. That night there was no wind, just the occasional creak of branches under the weight of snow. He walked with his hands deep in his coat pockets, breath fogging out in steady puffs. Then he saw something ahead. At first it looked like a tree trunk in the middle of the path, but as he drew closer, he realized it was too smooth, too tall. It didn't move, didn't sway. It simply stood there, silent and still. He stopped. The figure was roughly 70 tall, with a narrow frame and skin so pale it almost glowed against the dark trees. Its limbs were thin, and its head was elongated, slightly tilted. But it was the eyes that froze him. Large, completely black, and glowing faintly red from within. They stared at him without blinking. Carvey's body refused to move. He felt no fear, at least not at first. Just confusion, curiosity, a kind of dreamlike paralysis. His breathing slowed. Time stretched. The figure didn't approach. It didn't gesture. It just watched. Then it slowly raised its left arm, not threateningly, just deliberately, and pointed into the woods beside him. Carvey turned to look, half expecting to see something or someone, but there was only darkness and trees. When he looked back, the figure was gone. No sound, no footsteps, no wind, just a faint warmth in the air, as if a stove had been burning nearby. He waited for minutes, maybe more, before his body allowed him to move again. He turned around and walked straight home, never looking back. For weeks afterward, he suffered from vivid, almost feverish dreams. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, with fragments of memories that didn't feel like his own. Tall hallways made of metal, lights that pulsed without source, a low hum he could feel in his teeth. He developed sudden nosebleeds, headaches, static shocks from every surface. He didn't tell anyone at first, not until years later, after reading similar stories online. Stories of watchers, figures with glowing red eyes appearing in isolated areas, silently observing. He found others who had seen the same thing, though scattered across the world, separated by decades. No one had answers, only questions. Kai moved to the city a year after the sighting. He never walked that trail again. And though he told himself he'd imagined it, that it was the cold or fatigue or some trick of the light, he never forgot the eyes, the pale figure, the gesture toward the trees, the stillness of it all. He sometimes wonders what might have happened if he'd followed where it pointed. What lay in the woods just beyond his line of sight? But some part of him is glad he didn't find out, because whatever it was, it had been waiting and watching. Story 3: The Churchyard Lights. It was late summer in Dorset, England. The kind of warm, damp August evening where the sky hangs pink for hours and the air carries the scent of hay and distant sea salt. In the village of Charminster, life moved slowly, and nights were quiet, peaceful. That summer, though, something strange began to happen in the old churchyard. It started with a farmer on his way home after dusk. He passed the stone wall of the church just as the sun was slipping below the hills. And as he glanced toward the rows of crooked gravestones, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. A soft blue light hovering in the air above one of the graves. It shimmered faintly, like moonlight on water. And then, just as quickly, it blinked out. He told no one, but a few nights later, Two schoolboys, sneaking out with torches, saw the lights too, several of them drifting among the gravestones like fireflies. They were silent, glowing pale blue, moving too slowly and too deliberately to be insects or tricks of the eye. The boys approached, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel path. The lights didn't vanish. They simply floated, waiting. One of the boys said later he heard something. A whisper, a voice not quite human, saying words he didn't understand. The other boy fainted where he stood. When he came to, he couldn't remember what he'd heard, only that he felt watched, judged. Within days, more sightings followed. The local vicar saw the lights through his office window and refused to speak of it again. A retired nurse walking her dog swore she saw one of the lights pass straight through a stone cross. Her dog barked wildly, then whimpered for days. The lights came only at night, always blue, always hovering, always silent. Then, one evening, a curious amateur photographer from the next town set up a camera in the churchyard, hoping to capture what so many had described. He waited for hours. Nothing, not a flicker, until just before midnight. Suddenly, his camera powered off. Completely drained, the air felt heavy. The silence became oppressive, and then the lights came. He later told a local reporter he'd seen at least 5 orbs, each about the size of a grapefruit, moving together in a pattern that felt almost intelligent. They circled the central gravestone, pulsing softly, as if communicating. Then, one by one, they lifted into the air and disappeared straight upward. No sound, no trail, just gone. After that night, the lights were never seen again. The churchyard returned to its quiet slumber, its gravestones mossy and undisturbed. The villagers slowly stopped talking about it, as if by mutual agreement. The events of that August were left to drift quietly into memory. But if you walk by the church on a late summer night and the mist clings low to the ground, some say you might still feel the hair rise on the back of your neck, a presence just out of sight. And if you listen closely, you might hear the faint hum of something old, something watching, and something that once called the dead to glow. Story 4. The Silent Convoy. It was a cloudless night in early spring, and the sky over eastern Montana stretched wide and black, speckled with stars. A long-haul trucker named Dave was hauling a load of industrial pipe across the plains, riding the quieter state routes to avoid the interstate traffic. It was just after midnight. No towns for miles, only the steady hum of the wheels beneath him and the static of the CB. He'd driven this stretch many times before, but that night something felt different. His headlights illuminated only empty road ahead, rolling grassland on either side. No other cars, no moon, just the glow of the dash and the shape of the land rolling away into dark nothing. Then, without warning, the radio cut out. No static, no fade, just silence. At first, Dave assumed the radio had simply failed. He tapped it, checked the antenna. But then he noticed something stranger. The lights on his dash were flickering. His speedometer wavered, dipping suddenly. The truck's engine coughed, then continued as if nothing had happened. He slowed the rig, eyes sweeping the sky. That's when he saw them. 3 black triangles flying low, almost directly above the road. Each one was massive, maybe the size of a city block, flat, smooth, with soft white lights on each corner. They moved in perfect formation, slow, silent, impossibly silent. No engine, no wind disturbance, just a heavy presence above. He pulled over and stepped out of the cab. The air felt wrong, thick, still, electric, like a thunderstorm that never came. The 3 craft hovered steadily above the road, maybe a few hundred feet up, slowly gliding forward. No flashing lights, no markings, just geometry and motion. Dave stood frozen. He couldn't tell how long he watched. Minutes, maybe more. There was a strange feeling in his chest, like pressure, not pain, just weight. Then everything changed. He blinked, and suddenly he was driving. The truck was in motion. The road signs had changed. The sky had lightened slightly as if an hour had passed. The radio was still dead, but the dash lights were back to normal. His coffee, still half full in the cup holder, was now cold. He checked his GPS. He was 31 my further than he remembered being, and he couldn't recall a single second of it. His dash cam, which he always ran at night, was still recording. But when he checked the footage at a truck stop later that morning, there was a glitch. At the exact time he saw the triangles, the video scrambled, static distortion, and then resumed with him already on the highway again, miles down the road. He didn't report it, didn't call it in, didn't tell his dispatcher, but a week later, he received an anonymous email with no message, just a file. Inside was an edited version of his dash cam footage. Except this version showed the three triangles clearly floating above the road, framed in perfect darkness. He never found out who sent it. He deleted it the next day. He didn't want to know more. Some nights when he drives long stretches of quiet road, Dave looks up at the stars and wonders how many others have seen them too. Craft that move like shadows, engines that make no sound, time that slips without notice, and always that heavy silence that seems to follow them. Story 5. The Glass Forest. Deep in the frozen wilderness of central Siberia lies a stretch of forest that to this day no one willingly enters. The locals call it Metles, the dead wood, but its real name was lost long ago. In February of 1976, a Soviet geology team ventured into this forest to study a patch of land where compasses spun uncontrollably and radio signals failed. They were used to cold, used to isolation, but they were not prepared for what they found. The trees changed without warning. At first, they were typical Siberian pines, tall and thick. Then, about 20 kilometers in, the forest shifted. The trees became pale, almost colorless, bark smooth as marble. No birds, no sound. The snow underfoot grew brittle with a faint greenish tint. And then the glass began, stretching across the forest floor in scattered shards were what looked like panes of melted glass, smooth, rippling, some clear, others stained with rainbow hues. The trees in this zone were warped, bent away from a central point as though something massive had exploded, without fire. At the center of it all was a perfect circle about 60 feet wide. No snow, no ice, no debris, just scorched soil fused into a plate of black glass. No footprints inside it, no animals, nothing. The instruments the team brought refused to work. Batteries drained in seconds, cameras jammed, metal warped. One of the team's compasses spun so violently it shattered its casing. One man, Vadim, stepped into the circle before anyone could stop him. The air inside shimmered slightly. He called out, but his voice didn't echo. He waved, but his silhouette appeared slightly wrong, like a film reel out of sync. He smiled and walked further in. Then he vanished. No flash, no sound, just gone. The team ran forward, but as soon as they reached the edge, all but one were struck with sudden nausea and dizziness. One man collapsed and vomited. Another began bleeding from his nose. They dragged each other back out of the forest. A rescue team arrived 2 days later, but the circle was gone. Where the scorched glass had been, there was now only fresh snow and straight, unbroken trees. No sign of the geological team's campsite. No glass. No warped metal. Veeam was never found. The official report listed him as lost to terrain conditions, but the rest of the team never returned to field work. Several developed rare cancers within a year. Years later, satellite photos of the area would show strange heat signatures even in the dead of winter. Perfect circles of warmth with no source, always shifting, never staying in one place for more than a few days. And in the quiet corners of Russian folklore, some whisper that the forest is not dead, but watching that it remembers that something fell there long ago, something not meant for this world. They say if you go deep enough, the trees start to bend again, the snow grows glassy, the air begins to hum, and if you find the circle, you may not come back. Story 6. The Lake Visitor. Lac St. John sits in the northern stretches of Quebec, wide and still and deep. The kind of lake that holds its silence well. Surrounded by pine forests and long, narrow roads, it's the perfect place to disappear into nature or into something else entirely. In the summer of 2003, a group of 4 campers set up their tents along the lake's southern edge. They were in their 20s, students on a break, looking to escape the city. The air was crisp, the water clear, and the sky cloudless. They built a fire, cooked sausages, laughed into the dark. It was after midnight when they noticed the lake had gone unnaturally still. No wind, no lapping water. The fire hissed as the breeze vanished completely. Then the light came. Above the lake, hovering maybe 100 feet above the water, was a massive oval-shaped object. It didn't flash. It didn't buzz. It simply existed. There in the sky, quiet and steady, as if it had always been. Its surface was metallic, but with no seams, smooth like a stone worn by centuries. Lights ringed its center, glowing faintly in colors they couldn't quite describe. Somewhere between violet and green, shifting without pattern. The campers stood silent. None of them reached for a phone or flashlight. They just stared. Then one of them, Marianne, pointed. There, directly beneath the craft, a shape stood on the surface of the lake. A figure still upright, standing not in the water but on it. It was tall, taller than any person should be, and slender. Its limbs hung low. Its skin appeared pale, almost bluish in the reflected light. No face could be seen, no features, just the form of something not human, yet not entirely alien to the imagination either. The fire popped loudly behind them, and when they turned back to the lake, the craft was gone, and so was the figure. The silence lingered. The water still didn't move. One camper whispered that he'd stopped breathing during the sighting, only realizing it when his chest achawed. They didn't sleep that night. In the morning, they packed up quickly. No one wanted to admit it out loud, but they all felt it. The air hadn't gone back to normal. The lake no longer felt safe. Back home, they searched online. There were no official reports, no news stories, but buried in obscure forums and translated threads. They found similar accounts going back decades of silent crafts over remote lakes in Quebec and figures that watched from the water's surface. Mary Ann never went camping again. Story 7. The Shepherd's Story. The Scottish Highlands are a land of wind and silence. Rolling moors stretch endlessly, broken only by the occasional stone wall, a grazing sheep, or a distant glint of low. In the spring of 1958, an old shepherd named Ewan McNeil tended his flock near Glen Lyon, one of the quietest and least traveled valleys in the region. Ewan lived alone in a modest stone cottage with his border collie Bramble. He was a man of few words, grounded in routine and superstition, like many Highlanders of the time. His days were spent among the hills, his nights by the fire, and his only companions were his sheep, the ever-changing sky. One evening, just after sunset, Ewan noticed something strange. A section of sky above the far hill had turned a shade of deep amber, unnatural, glowing faintly, even as the rest of the horizon faded to black. He watched for several minutes, expecting it to fade, but it didn't. The light hovered, then began to move slowly, deliberately. As it drifted closer, Ewan could make out its shape. A tall, vertical structure, like a pillar of light, floating silently just above the ground. Following the curve of the hills, it cast no shadow. It gave off no heat, just an eerie, pulsing presence. Bramble growled low, fur bristling, eyes fixed on the shape. Then the sheep began to move, not run, but walk in a tight, unnatural circle, as if something was pulling them gently, like a current. Ewan tried to call to them, but his voice seemed to fall flat in the air. No echo, no wind, just the silent turning of woolly backs. Then he saw them. Figures, 3, maybe 4, standing near the pillar, tall, slender, unmoving. They wore no clothes, yet their bodies didn't look human. Smooth, thin, with elongated heads and no visible eyes. Just a shimmering, reflective surface where their faces should have been, like living mirrors. Ewan could not move. He later said It felt like standing inside a deep dream. A part of him knew he was watching something beyond the world he knew. And yet he felt calm, not welcome, but not afraid either. The figures turned in perfect synchrony and stepped back into the pillar. It rose slowly, silently into the air, then blinked out with no sound at all. The sky went black. The sheep stopped circling. Bramble sat down, trembling. Ewan didn't sleep that night. He returned to town the next day to report what he'd seen. Few believe. Story 8. The Signal over Sinai. The Sinai Peninsula is a place of ancient silence. Sand stretches endlessly, broken by jagged mountains and deep starlit skies. In 1982, during a lull in regional conflict, a team of Egyptian communication specialists was stationed at a remote outpost near the Jabal Musa range, far from cities, surrounded only by desert wind. They were tasked with monitoring radio transmissions across the region. Most nights were routine, static, coded chatter, the hum of long-distance frequencies. But one night, something unusual began to bleed into their monitors. At exactly 2:13 a.m., every channel went dead. No static, no interference, just silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy. Then one of the men, Adele, noticed a frequency active that wasn't on their list. An unmarked band, narrow, clean. He adjusted the dials carefully and leaned in. A low pulse like a heartbeat through metal. Then a voice, but not a language they recognized. Not Arabic, not English, something else. Rhythmic, tonal, layered with an almost melodic hum. As they listened, the temperature in the small monitoring hut dropped. The lights flickered, and above the desert outside, something appeared. They described it as a long dark spindle, slowly rotating, not quite touching the ground, yet not high in the sky either. It hovered between mountain peaks, its surface matte and seamless. No lights, no windows, just shape. One man walked outside and began muttering, not in Arabic, but something none of them could understand. His eyes were unfocused, his steps uncertain. When they brought him back inside, he collapsed and slept for 12 hours. The signal continued for precisely 33 minutes. Then it stopped, and the stars above the outpost shifted. It wasn't obvious at first, but several men swore the stars had moved slightly, as if space itself had been stretched and released. One technician reported that all his watches were now off by exactly 7 seconds. The next day, their commanding officer ordered the recordings destroyed. But one man, Adele, kept a copy. Years later, he played the signal for a visiting French researcher who specialized in rare languages. The researcher reportedly went pale halfway through. He said the tones matched no human dialect, but carried the exact mathematical intervals of high-level code, like a signal meant to teach or test. Adele never played the tape again. The researcher left the next day without finishing his study. Story 9. The Fog Station, Maine, 1969. Along the jagged coast of Maine, where the Atlantic crashes against black rocks and mist rolls in thick from the sea, there once stood an isolated weather station just outside the town of Machiasport. It sat on a cliff edge, an aging structure of metal and glass manned by 2 technicians on rotating shifts. In the fall of 1969, the station was operated by a man named Walter Hensley, a former Navy meteorologist who preferred solitude to society. His assignment was simple: monitor barometric changes and transmit twice daily reports to a research center inland. But one night, a strange fog arrived. It came in sudden, unnaturally fast. One moment, the moon was casting a silver line across the ocean. The next, it was gone. Visibility dropped to nothing. Radios crackled. Static hummed through the walls. And then the lights failed. Walter fumbled for backup power. The generator clicked on, but the station sensors refused to boot. Every dial spun. Every display blinked random symbols. Then through the thick glass of the observation window, he saw it. Something hovering just above the sea. A sphere, smooth, metallic, perfectly still. It glowed faintly with a bluish hue, the kind of light that didn't reflect off the water but sank into it. It hovered for what seemed like minutes, silent, watching. Walter recorded it in his log by hand, noting every minute. But when he tried to use the radio to report it, all he heard was a low modulated tone, not a buzz, not static, but a pulse. He stood at the window, transfixed. Then from the fog came a shape, a human shape, but too tall. Its silhouette shimmered slightly like heat above a flame. It moved toward the station slowly, steadily through fog that never parted. Walter backed away from the glass. The figure paused just 10 feet from the door. Then everything stopped. The fog evaporated in seconds. The light vanished. The sensors rebooted, and the station was silent again, like nothing had happened. But Walter wasn't the same. He left his post the next morning, never returned. His written logs were found intact, but the final page was odd. Dozens of hand-sketched circles, each one shaded differently, each marked with an identical note. Not fog, not sea, not alone. Local fishermen say the fog still comes that fast sometimes, and when it does, the gulls go quiet. Story 10. The passenger in seat 33A. Over the Pacific. 1997. In December of 1997, Flight 815, a commercial red-eye traveling from Tokyo to Los Angeles, was halfway over the Pacific when the cabin lights dimmed for the night. Most passengers were asleep. Outside, the world was nothing but clouds and black ocean. Seat 33A was a window seat near the rear of the aircraft. A man named Daniel Pierce sat there, returning from a business trip, unable to sleep. He was reading a dog-eared paperback when he noticed something strange outside the window. A light. But it wasn't a star. It was closer. Far too close. It moved alongside the plane, perfectly matched in speed. A glowing sphere, dull orange in color, like heated metal. It pulsed gently, not blinking, but breathing. And as Daniel stared, he realized it wasn't the only one. 3 more appeared in formation, triangular, silent. They flew just below the wing level, far too close for another aircraft. But there was no turbulence, No sound, no alarm. The cabin remained quiet. Then came the hum, low, deep, like it came from within his own chest. He looked around. No one else stirred. Not the flight attendants, not the other passengers. It was as if time had slowed. The lights outside the window began to shift, not in shape, but in color. Soft gradients of red and violet, impossible to describe. And then between the lights, he saw it. A figure, just for a moment. It was seated beside him, tall, unmoving, expressionless. Its skin was smooth and pale, and its eyes, if they were eyes, reflected no light. It didn't turn to him. It didn't speak, but Daniel felt a word enter his mind anyway, clear as if whispered in his ear. Observe. He blinked, and everything was back. Cabin lights, snoring passengers, flight attendants moving through the aisle. The lights outside were gone. Daniel reached for his book, but it was closed with a bookmark tucked into a page he hadn't reached yet. When the plane landed, he didn't speak to anyone, but later, while checking his seat number on the boarding stub, he noticed something odd. Flight 815 had no seat 33A. The row ended at 32. There was no record of his seat ever existing. He never flew again, and sometimes, even years later, he'd wake in the middle of the night with a pressure in his ears and a soft word still echoing in his head. Observe. Story 11. The Moonlit House, Argentina, 1989. In the quiet hills of Cordoba province, Argentina, where dirt roads wind through tall grass and power lines fade into the horizon, there once stood a house at the edge of an empty field. It had belonged to the Velasco family for generations. A modest farmhouse with a red tin roof and an old windmill that creaked in the breeze. By 1989, only Rosso the Lasco remained. A retired school teacher in her 70s, she lived simply, keeping a garden, a few chickens, and her black dog, Matil. She felt safe in her solitude until one night in early spring. It began with a sound, not loud, but sharp, like static from an old radio. Rosa was in bed, drifting off when she heard it. She sat up and Mateo growled from the foot of the bed. Outside, the moon was nearly full. She pulled back the curtain and saw lights, flickering orbs just above the field. Not lanterns, not headlights. They moved with strange fluid precision, gliding, weaving as if searching. She opened the back door quietly. Then she noticed something else. Her garden was glowing. A bluish light rose from the soil, casting long, odd shadows across the fence. The air felt heavy like the moment before lightning. Then she saw them. Two figures, thin, taller than men, their skin pale, gray-blue like polished stone. They stood beyond the vegetables, perfectly still. Rosa froze. Mateo didn't bark. He only whimpered low and frightened. The figures said nothing, but Rosa felt something. A thought, maybe a memory that wasn't hers, a street she'd never seen, a voice she didn't recognize. Then the windmill stopped turning. The orbs blinked out one by one. The figures turned, moving in unison, and walked into the tall grass. The light faded. The air returned. The next morning, everything seemed normal, except for one vine that had grown over a meter overnight. Its tomato was warm to the touch, ripe beyond reason. She told no one. Years later, neighbors spoke of strange lights near the property. Some heard static by the windmill, and long after Rosa passed, the house was found with its door wide open. No sign of damage or theft. Just one overripe tomato sitting on the kitchen table, still warm. Story 12. The Lost Time of Dr. Ari, Finland, 1974. In the winter of 1974, Dr. Simo Ilari, a physicist from Helsinki, traveled north for a solo retreat. He rented a cabin near Lake Inari, deep in Lapland's snow-covered wilderness. The cabin had no electricity, just a fireplace, a kerosene lamp, and a radio for weather reports. Ari wasn't there to rest. He brought notebooks, hoping the isolation would help him concentrate. Each day, he hiked the frozen lake's edge. Each night, he worked beside the fire. On the sixth evening, just after dusk, a strange hum began. It didn't come from the radio. It vibrated through the floor, through the walls, low, steady, almost musical. He stepped outside, expecting a snowmobile in the distance. But there was only silence. Then he saw it, hovering high above the frozen lake was a pale disk of light, not spinning, not blinking. It floated motionless, its glow soft and cold. The light didn't cast shadows. It shimmered on the snow like moonlight beneath water. Then the hum stopped. No wind, no sound. Even the cold seemed distant, suspended. Ari looked at his watch, a mechanical one he wound every night. The second hand had frozen. The disk tilted slightly, then pulsed with a single flash of white light. He blinked, and it was morning. The fire had gone out. His tea kettle was cold. 2 days had passed. The date on his calendar had moved forward, but he remembered nothing. His boots were wet, as if he'd been walking through snow. His journal was open to a new page, one he hadn't written. Curved symbols stretched across the paper in neat rows. At the bottom, a small circle divided by a wave. Ari left that same day. He never spoke publicly about what happened, but colleagues noticed something shift. He abandoned his research in theoretical physics, turned instead to sound, to resonance. In letters, he mentioned a theory he called harmonic displacement. No one ever understood it. He died in 1993. The cabin was sold. The journal was still on the shelf. The strange page remained. Years later, a local skier claimed to see a dull ring of light hovering above the lake. He said it made no sound, but when he looked at his watch, 5 minutes had disappeared. Story 13. The Lights Beneath Loch Mar, Scotland, 2001. Loch Morar is one of the deepest bodies of fresh water in Europe. Cold, dark, and largely untouched. Tucked into the western highlands of Scotland, it's a place of fog and stone where the hills fall steep into the loch's glassy surface. Legends of a monster called Morag have lingered for centuries, but in 2001, something even stranger may have stirred beneath the water. Duncan Fraser, a forestry worker from Fort William, spent most of his time maintaining trails on the loch's northern shore. That summer, he was given a week-long contract to repair fencing along the eastern bank, where access was limited and the woods grew dense. He brought a small tent, a gas stove, and a camera he used to photograph wildlife and landscapes. His second night by the lock was still with a crescent moon rising. Duncan sat by his campfire near the water's edge sipping tea when he noticed a pale glow just beneath the surface of the lock. At first he assumed it was moonlight, but it moved slowly against the direction of the current. Then it split into two lights, both round, both dim, and they began to rotate around one another like twin stars caught in orbit. He stood, camera in hand, and walked closer. The lights descended deeper into the water, then rose again, closer now, still beneath the surface, but casting a faint shimmer on the rocks at his feet. They were silent. The lock remained perfectly still. No waves, no splashes. Suddenly, a third light appeared, brighter, more concentrated, and shaped not like a ball, but a beam pointing directly upward. Duncan stepped back. He described the sensation as a pressure in the air, as though the atmosphere itself had thickened. He didn't feel fear, only awe, and a deep rooted instinct not to move. The lights began to rise, still beneath the water, but faster now. Then they blinked out all at once, and the lock went black. The next morning he found no sign of disturbance, but the photos on his camera, everyone taken that night, were completely blank. Not corrupted, just pure white frames, as if exposed to direct light. The images, before and after, were unaffected. 2 days later, Duncan reported the incident to a local ranger. He didn't mention aliens, just lights, movement, and something not normal. The ranger listened silently. When Duncan finished, the man only said, "People forget how deep this lock really goes." In the years that followed, others began reporting strange sights on the eastern bank. Small lights under the water, fish found stunned but unharmed. And one diver, an experienced military-trained free diver, claimed to hear a low-frequency hum at 200 feet, like an engine buried in rock. No structures have ever been found at the bottom of Lomora, but the lights still return some nights, spinning, waiting just beneath the surface, where nothing is supposed to shine. Story 14, The Transmission Tower, Montana, 1962. In 1962, deep in the snowy hills outside Great Falls, Montana, a small government communications site stood alone on a ridge. It was known simply as Tower 7, a steel radio tower with a low cinder block building at its base. Staffed by 2 men per shift, its purpose was basic: relay microwave signals between military installations. Most nights were uneventful. That winter, James Delaney, a quiet man with a background in electronics, worked the midnight shift alone. His partner had been reassigned unexpectedly, and until a replacement arrived, James maintained the equipment solo. It was on his third night alone that things changed. Around 2:15 a.m., a low tone began to seep through the building's receiver. Not interference, not static. A precise, steady frequency. James checked the readouts. Nothing unusual. The tone didn't match any active channels. And when he tried to isolate it, the entire console dimmed. Then the tower lights flickered. He stepped outside into the freezing wind. The air was perfectly still. No storm, no clouds. But above the ridge, perhaps 30 foot above the tower's tip, hovered a dull, matte black object. It was disc-shaped, featureless, and completely silent. James stood motionless. The object remained perfectly still for nearly 2 minutes. Then, from its underside, a beam of red light extended, not onto the ground, but across the air, connecting directly to the top of the tower. And then the tone returned louder now, not from the equipment, but from the object itself. It vibrated in the metal around him, in the soil, in his chest. Then the light snapped off. The disc tilted slowly, turned without sound, and disappeared into the night sky in a smooth horizontal blur. No arc, no trail, just gone. James returned inside. The equipment was dead. The backup systems wouldn't engage. And when technicians arrived the next day, they found every recording tape from the previous 12 hours completely blank. He filed a standard report, omitting the object. But several nights later, a different technician, unaware of James's experience, refused to return after his shift. He'd heard a tone, he said, and felt like something was watching from above. By spring, Tower 7 was quietly shut down. The structure still stands, rusting in the wind, cables cut. Locals avoid the ridge, saying the air there feels wrong. And some still report seeing a faint red line stretching through the cold sky, far above where the signal ever should have gone. Story 15. The Floating Girl, Uzbekistan, 1995. In the spring of 1995, a small village outside Samarkand, Uzbekistan, experienced an event that was whispered about for years, but never formally reported. It was a place of quiet farms and wide skies where children played in the fields and elders watched the world move slowly past. One of those children was a girl named Amina. She was 10 years old, shy, and often wandered the meadows behind her family's home. On a warm afternoon in late April, she was seen walking toward the edge of the fields with her usual notebook and pencil. She liked to draw birds and clouds. That evening, however, she didn't return. The sun had just set when her older brother ran back to the house, pale and out of breath. He'd seen Amina floating, not lying down, not levitating off the ground in sleep, floating upright, arms at her sides, 10 feet in the air, motionless. At first, her parents thought it was a trick or a child's panic. But when they and several neighbors hurried to the edge of the field, they saw it too. Amina hovered silently above the grass. Above her, a perfect silver sphere hovered, smooth, metallic, no markings. It made no sound, no light. It simply hung in the air directly above the girl, as if tethered by some invisible string. One witness later described the scene as too quiet, as if all sound had been drawn away. Amina did not cry, did not move. Her eyes were open, calm, focused on something no one else could see. Then, without warning, the sphere pulsed just once and began to rise. Amina followed. She ascended slowly, eyes still fixed on something above. At 20 feet, her body seemed to shimmer. Then, gently, she was lowered back to the ground. As soon as her feet touched the earth, the sphere vanished. No trail, no flash, just empty sky. Amina blinked, looked around, and asked why everyone was staring. She remembered nothing. No sound, no floating, no silver light. Doctors found nothing wrong with her. She lived a long, quiet life and never showed signs of trauma. But for the rest of her days, she claimed she often dreamed of shapes, perfect glowing spheres, and said she felt most at peace when walking near the edge of the fields under a wide, empty sky. To this day, the locals remember that afternoon. Some say it was a miracle, others something else, but all agree nothing that silent should ever come from above. Story 16. The Mirror on Route 13, Virginia, 1980. In the fall of 1980, along a quiet stretch of Route 13 in rural Virginia, a strange sight was reported by two highway workers just after midnight. It looked like a pane of glass, tall, narrow, standing upright on the side of the road. When they got closer, they realized it was a mirror, not broken, not leaning, perfectly vertical, nearly 6 feet tall, without a frame or stand. It reflected only the darkness behind them, but not the headlights. That was the first odd thing. Michael stepped in front of it, but saw no reflection, just the road continuing endlessly behind him. Not the real one, another version, one that curved sharply to the right into a pine grove that didn't exist. They both stared at it. In the mirror, fog rolled across the road's surface. Shapes moved in the distance, tall and thin, walking slowly across the false highway. There were no faces, no lights, just shadows that paused occasionally as if listening. Leon reached out and touched the surface. It wasn't cold. It wasn't warm. It had no temperature at all. Then the mirror shimmered only slightly, like heat rising off asphalt. A sharp tone rang out, brief and piercing, like metal scraped across metal. The shapes in the reflection turned slowly all at once, as if they had noticed the watchers. Michael stepped back. Leon didn't. He was frozen, staring into the mirror, eyes wide. Then, for just a moment, Michael saw Leon's reflection. Not beside him, but deep within the mirrored road, walking into that strange pond.